Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Survivor Economic Security, the Justice System, and the Role of Victim Advocates, hosted by Wider Opportunities for Women. My name is Mallory Dusenberry, and I'm the Associate Director for the Economic Security for Survivors Project here at WOW. First, I would like to do a little housekeeping. Your lines have been muted to ensure that background noise does not interfere with today's conversation. If you have technical issues or questions during the presentation, please use the meeting chat located in the bottom corner of your screen. At the end of today's discussion, you will have the opportunity to ask questions over the phone, and you may submit questions throughout the presentation over the chat function that we will be sure to get to. We will send out a recording of the webinar along with the PowerPoint slides and any relevant resources tomorrow. The purpose of today's webinar is to outline the unique role of victim advocates both in community-based organizations as well as in the justice system in keeping survivors safe through economic security, and to offer specific strategies to accomplish this. Following a riveting discussion with our expert panel, we will introduce WOW's latest tool, the Victim Advocates Guide to Safety and Economic Security for Victims of Violence Against Women. For those of you who are new to us today, Wider Opportunities for Women works both nationally and locally in Washington, D.C. to promote economic independence and equality of opportunity for women and girls. For 50 years now, WOW has helped women with programs emphasizing quality jobs, gender equity, and lifelong economic security. To accomplish these goals, WOW engages in national policy advocacy, technical assistance, and research initiatives. The Economic Security for Survivors Project recognizes that survivor safety and economic security are inextricably linked and promotes strategies that foster economic security within the systems that serve survivors. The S Project provides resources, education, training, and technical assistance to transitional housing programs and other direct service providers, state and local governments, domestic violence and sexual assault coalitions, and state criminal justice systems through VAWA's STOP grant program. Our activities include on-site state trainings, guides and policy briefs, webinars and curricula development, and a monthly newsletter. I'm joined today by Robin Thompson, who serves as WOW faculty and greatly contributes to the S Project with her experience as an attorney and former STOP administrator in Florida. Our wonderful panel includes Susan Moen, Executive Director of the Jackson County Sexual Assault Response Team. Susan has worked in the field of sexual assault advocacy for over 20 years and has a special interest in sexual violence prevention. Susan has presented on numerous webinars, trainings, and conferences, and in 2010 she received the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force SART Award. She is particularly proud of her work with the Ashland Police Department's You Have Options program, which recognizes the need for a victim-centered and offender-focused response to sexual violence by law enforcement professionals. Next, we have Kaylin Risker, who is a survivor of domestic violence and a human resources professional. In 2006, Kaylin founded the nonprofit Sisters Acquiring Financial Empowerment. SAFE provides survivors of domestic violence the appropriate financial tools and resources needed to leave or recover from the economic portion of domestic violence. Kaylin is a member of several leadership and advisory committees, including Avon's National Domestic Violence Advisory Board, NNEDV's Career Development Advisory Council, Wayne County Council Against Family Violence, and Transformation Detroit. Kaylin and SAFE have also received numerous honors, including NNEDV's 2009 Spirit of Advocacy Award. And last but not least, we are joined by Allison Smith-Burke, who has served as the Director of Public Policy at the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence since 2005. She has worked in the domestic violence movement for over 10 years, including her tenure at GCADV and the Northwest Georgia Family Crisis Center. Her expertise is in the area of public policy and systems advocacy, economic abuse and economic security for survivors, and the intersection of domestic violence and child maltreatment. In this vein, Allison also worked for many years in public child welfare at the Clark County Department of Family and Children's Services and in homelessness intervention at the Athens Area Homeless Shelter. In 2014, Allison was elected to serve on NNEDV's Public Policy Committee as well. Before we launch into the discussion, I want to give a quick overview of why we're talking about economic security for survivors. Let's start by defining what exactly economic security is. One must, of course, be able to earn enough to cover basic needs and daily expenses. However, economic security goes beyond basic self-sufficiency. It also requires having the finances to protect one into retirement and from unexpected events, such as a violent attack. As a result, WOW defines economic security as having the income, assets, and access to services to meet basic needs listed here, participate in the workforce, and build savings over the lifespan. WOW calculates what one needs to earn to be economically secure in every state and county for up to 420 different family types. We found that economic security wages are far above both minimum wage and the poverty line. For example, a single worker needs to earn about $14 per hour, and a single parent with 2 kids needs to earn approximately $27 per hour. For those with children, the largest expenses are childcare, housing, and transportation, which are the 3 largest economic barriers frequently cited by survivors as well. WOW also compares best numbers to actual labor market data and finds that 45% of all Americans live without economic security. And due to childcare costs, discrimination, and a lack of access to good jobs and support systems, 60% of single women and 81% of single mothers are economically insecure. Economic security becomes even more important for survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, who may have greater economic needs. The economic cost of violence is huge, ranging from job or housing loss to expenses for health care, relocation, and security measures. Offenders also often perpetrate economic abuse as a tool of power and control and to create dependency. Examples include controlled finances, compromised credit, work interference, and even identity theft. These two impacts combine to create barriers to survivors recovering, staying safe, and achieving independence. Our panelists will go into much more detail on these issues shortly. And while there are overlaps of both the occurrence and the economic impacts between intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking, there can also be clear differences. For example, dependency issues are much more common in intimate partner violence cases, and sexual assault may be perpetrated by a coworker or a supervisor, resulting in unique impacts on employment. There are also big differences in legal access to legal remedies, depending on which of these crimes is committed, or the timing of reporting as well. So due to the wide-ranging and lifelong economic impacts of violence, it's essential that survivors receive help and support from the entire system to stay safe and economically secure. Addressing economic security is not just the role of direct service providers. The justice system and other sectors also have the potential to help or harm the economic security and therefore safety of survivors. However, because advocates tend to be positioned across many of these systems and take a direct communication role, we're talking very much today about what advocates can do. So to explore the unique role of victim advocates within these systems, I'm going to turn it over to Robin Thompson and our guest speakers. Robin?
Thanks very much, Mallory, and welcome everybody. It's great to be with you today. We have, as Mallory said, a great panel to talk about and to go deeper into both the guide for advocates and to explore the groundwork that Mallory laid in those intro slides. I'd like to start off with probably one of the most basic questions, or I should say a foundational question that really is one of those let's start the discussion broadly and then we can kind of drill down. And the first one is to sort of explore how survivor economic security affects their safety and the work of advocates in the justice system. So we're talking about the basics, that inextricable link that Mallory mentioned in the beginning, and how both their safety and the advocates within the justice system can work together. I'd like to throw it immediately to Kaylin to talk about this a little bit, and maybe you can explore with us some of those issues and what you think about when you see this question.
Well, talking about how the self-sufficiency works with survivors of domestic violence and how advocates can help with that, it's really important in looking at the individuals that we service and their own personal safety. So even exploring the issue of how does one seek work, or how do you start a micro-entrepreneurial endeavor if you're being stalked, or if you're concerned about the safety of your children. So just going to the bank or just doing some of the things that someone not in a situation would take for granted is a challenge. Not making the decision to not go to a court date are things that we work with survivors of domestic violence every day. And so you look at, it's a strong intersection between, you can say, okay, well, we work in a silo and we just help victims of violence in these particular areas. This is our area of focus. But unfortunately, we can't do that because of this intersection. Because if a person is concerned about what's going on with them or their personal safety or their economic stability and the intersection between the two, then we don't get the opportunity to service them in other ways if those issues aren't addressed.
Exactly, and so you're looking at basic safety planning that as one of the most basic aspects of it is to understand how this issue gets incorporated into that safety planning on a regular basis.
And what's important is that sometimes it's done as an afterthought. Like, okay, well, you do this, 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 and this, and oh, by the way, let's look at the money, or oh, by the way, let's talk about safety planning in regards to, when you're online, or if you're doing online banking, or things of that nature. Protecting your credit card, or just being aware of your cell phone, and you look at all these different issues, but it may be done as an aside and not incorporated throughout the conversation. I think it should be done more fluidly.
Yeah, and as a core issue. Allison, it sounds like you were trying to jump in there.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No problem.
I think that our movement has been really accustomed to and gotten proficient in advocating within criminal justice system or civil legal system, and that's all well and good, and it's valuable. But we need those same advocacy skills around working with victims around economic justice issues, mainly because that's often what victims are bringing to us. If you think about, and if you remember back in college days, hearing about the Maslow's I think it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, hierarchy of needs, yeah.
But it's basically at the top is this self-actualization and, sort of the highest of human existence, peace and feeling secure. But you can't get to that tip-top level unless you have everything below it. At the very bottom are things like housing, clothing, shelter, food. Those are economic security issues. So when we're talking with victims who have issues around safety and are seeking safety and independence and this higher, being able to be empowered and independent, it's hard to talk with folks and get people to that level without addressing these very basic things first. So that's why I think it's so important. I mean, it really has changed advocacy from, helping victims work through the criminal legal options that they might have for safety, but really also going to what their options are for financial stability, because it is so, it can make the difference between someone staying or leaving, regardless of a prosecution of a crime, regardless of other things. That everybody needs a safe place to stay, and so really it has changed the way domestic violence advocates work pretty substantially, I think, because we're now focusing on those issues.
Yes, and I just add one more thing to that. It's important as advocates to know who we're servicing and what the needs are and what the access is. So, for example, SNAP or food benefits don't allow for things as feminine hygiene products or diapers and things of that nature. So if you're working with someone and their child, they're thinking in the back of their mind how their child needs diapers, and you're trying to have this group session and how they're hungry or how they might need their feminine needs met. It's a challenge to move from that place to the next. So as advocates, thinking about these things, can we stock our bathrooms with some supplies for the ladies? Can we, connect with another organization that can help us, help them provide diapers. These are things outside of what we normally do or what we have defined as our work, but it definitely intersects.
And then it sounds like, too, what you both are saying, and then to take it to the next step and bring Susan into the conversation, is that awareness about the economic needs of survivors also has to be keenly felt within the justice system, so that that system, as it grinds away, it really pays attention to how it approaches and can assist and certainly not hurt when it comes to victims being able to be economically secure. I mean, that is the root of this project, really, is to look at those key sectors within the justice system and on this webinar talk about also how advocates can, as ever, you said, Allison, work in the justice system, but how they can then maximize what the justice system can do to help that economic security for survivors. So, Susan, do you have any thoughts around those kinds of issues and what you've seen happen in Oregon?
Sure. So, the economic security issues are absolutely at play in how a survivor interacts with all the different pieces of the justice system. But I don't think that individuals within the legal system always understand that. So the very first thing that advocates need to do is to provide that education. For example, the situation of reporting. We need to recognize that a survivor's economic situation plays a huge role on whether or not they're going to report a crime in the first place to law enforcement. So just starting there. If you have a law enforcement agency that understands that economics could be a barrier to reporting, and you can get out in front of that with your survivor, then that's the first step. And then we certainly know that the economic impact of reporting can also factor into a survivor not wanting to go all the way through the justice systems once they've started. And so, again, it's providing that awareness that I think to advocates a lot of time is pretty much kind of a no-brainer. But law enforcement doesn't often think, wow, I'm asking her to come down to my agency to provide this report on, when I tell her to. And have I actually asked her, does she have transportation or does she need gas money? Have I asked her, does she have kids that she needs to find a sitter for, even just to come in and engage at that very first level with law enforcement? So these small pieces of where economics impact survivors' decisions to move forward, I think really need to be explained to law enforcement.
And when you talk about this, I'm reminded of some of our prep on this, where you talked about how this concept of economic security has sort of helped reframe your own work, and you've been doing work for a long time in the sexual assault arena in particular. Can you talk a little bit about that and what's that look like on the field for you? What does it look like, I should say, on the ground, I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first time I saw a WOW presentation, it was sort of light bulb because for so long, especially starting back, 20 years ago when I did, sexual assault and domestic advocacy were about stabilization in an acute situation, right? We go in, we respond to the hospital, or we go in and bring folks into an interview with law enforcement, but it really is focusing on that first week or two or maybe month, but not looking at the whole life experience of the survivor that we're working with. And so I have just found that not only am I now addressing the trauma and the needs that the survivor might have in order to get through the legal system if they're going through it, but also looking at questions like what's happening to the rest of their life, either as a result of this crime or even regardless of the crime. Where is this person in terms of their housing stability, because a survivor comes on our radar. They come to an advocate because of the crime, usually. But oftentimes what we find immediately is there are so many other things in their life that really they could use a hand tackling, whether it is things like housing or drug and alcohol issues or anything like that. And oftentimes these are folks who just haven't had the opportunity to access resources. And so advocacy can really be about addressing that part of their life as well, because I ultimately want to have somebody come out of the experience of seeking advocacy feeling like they are stronger and they are in a better position with their life, not just with maybe the process of reporting.
And that really, I've gone to the next slide here, which is, your beginning discussion about some of those specific steps that advocates can take. And, it's really great that you kind of root it like this. It makes me think of when we started the project, and I'm thinking that Mallory might be able to remember. Sometimes we had a little debate as to whether these issues around economic security were part of core services or whether they were additional. And it sounds clearly like everyone's saying now they're part of core services and they're part of what you need to do because that's what the survivor brings to you.
Absolutely. And when we, reckon back to the law enforcement piece as well, what I'm explaining to law enforcement is if you let advocacy in right away and help us address all of these issues, I always want to talk to law enforcement about how will that help you. So we pitch it as this idea that you are coming up with you're going to have a stronger survivor to work with. You're going to have a survivor who is less likely in disengaging from the system along the way because they are better supported. And you're going to have a survivor who sees that not only advocacy but also law enforcement really has a concern for their whole life, not just the piece where they're reporting a crime.
So the system works more smoothly when this is recognized. In other words, and Allison, speaking of the system, there are numerous places that economic security comes in, kind of in a really obvious way, like crimes comp and restitution, and then sometimes in the more subtle ways, in terms of consumer rights or other types of issues. Can you help us from a policy perspective, maybe go into some of those little things, big things, whatever they could be within the justice system that advocates can make a huge difference with?
Well, I think kind of going back to what's been said previously, working closely, having your nonprofit victim advocates who work at shelters and community-based programs, working as close as is possible without violating confidentiality around building and a support system around a victim in terms of their financial stability is so key. And I think victim advocates within prosecution have specific knowledge around restitution, around crime victims comp, and those things are helpful. But those things take some time, especially the restitution piece. But there's pieces that advocates really, nonprofit program advocates could learn that are helpful to a victim in the short term, and that's like advocacy and learning about a victim's rights around housing. And we have the benefit of a newly reauthorized Violence Against Women Act that really expands the protections for housing. So understanding how to navigate within those systems, within your local housing authority. Also, an advocate can improve things by understanding things like helping victims deal with the economic abuse that they may have suffered, or the problems that they may have economically that may be unrelated to domestic violence, things like problems with debt, problems with their credit report. So learning about, what do you do if you've got a victim who her perpetrator has charged up credit cards in her name, or who has stolen her identity and open lines of credit, So understanding how to fix those issues, because we know that some of these things have a sort of a snowball effect, and they impact a victim's ability to get housing and to get a job. So really getting to and understanding those rights, and understanding someone's rights around accessing child support, or accessing public benefits. What are someone's rights under, to get the family violence option waiver in the TANF program, because we know a lot of victims access TANF, as a bridge. And so it's important for advocates to understand, what are the rules around those systems? And, if someone's denied, what process do you go through to appeal? So that, brings another layer of systems advocacy. And, my hope, I come from a state domestic violence coalition. My hope is that folks that are working at local programs, working directly with victims, really are reaching out to their state domestic violence coalitions and to their sexual assault coalitions for help on these issues, because it's very real and tangible help that you can give to a victim.
And one of the things yes, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Oh, I was just going to say briefly, also with that knowledge, trying to spread that to law enforcement folks that you're working with. For example, I've seen one of the barriers to domestic violence and sexual assault survivors coming forward being that they're afraid that if they report and law enforcement comes out to their housing and they're like in low-income housing, that is going to be used against them. In terms of there's this sort of idea that goes around that if they get three law enforcement calls out to their house, then their housing can be revoked. And it's sort of more anecdotal than anything else, but it's a really strong feeling that our potential survivors, potential victims have. So if law enforcement is aware of that kind of stuff, they can tailor their response so that they don't trigger either that fear or that reality that they could actually impact somebody's housing simply by responding to a crime scene.
And the other part that's great. I was hoping to bring in this intersectionality with the justice system when you mentioned that. So that might mean the law enforcement agency can speak with the landlord, can intervene, however, in terms of trying to mitigate against any kind of eviction. But one of the things too, Allison, that you mentioned was you mentioned that a survivor suffers greatly if her identity is stolen, or if she's being stalked, or if there are specific economic crimes that are perpetrated against her. And part of our work with some of the other sectors that advocates could be so important and so impactful around is to discuss with the prosecutor and law enforcement that, hey, these are separate crimes, and they may not be identified as the typical, quote, domestic violence crime, or they may not be specific to what people might think of stalking, but in fact they are, and they might be chargeable as separate offenses, provable, and then there might be relief available to the victims if those separate crimes are also pursued in the system.
Yeah.
Kaylin, do you want to jump in a little bit and talking to us about steps that advocates can take maybe around financial and economic resources and other things that might be available in community?
Yes, there's actually quite a few things that are available in community. Some things are harder to access than others. So let's start with some basic things. So there's programs called individual development accounts. And that's a program where it provides a match, and it depends on the program what the level of match is, if it's 2-to-1 or 4-to-1, in 3 specific areas. One is in home buying, the other is starting a business, and the third is returning back to school. Really looking at, so you're looking at long-term goals as well as short-term goals. So transitioning from payday lending institutions that charge so much interest on payday loans and things of that nature. So it's important for advocates to find, banks and credit unions in the community that may offer things like second chance bank accounts that can start. That's something that's immediately you will notice a difference in your personal finances, transitioning from the payday lender institutions to traditional institutions that don't charge that high interest. Even using things like online resources, we refer a lot to just things like Google Voice for a phone number, a stable phone number, because sometimes when people have minute phones, and then it's hard for an employer, someone gets your resume, and now they want to call you for an interview, and it's hard for them to get in touch with you, or even your children's school, or for doctor's appointments, or even the program's trying to call you with resources to help you. So getting something like an online it's a free Google number that you could transfer to different phones. You could check your messages online, can help with you having the ability to manage your finances moving forward. So we talk about all these different things, even where you can, access free classes and brush up on some skills from online to libraries. And so meeting some of these needs on more of a exterior circle of the level, and then we can move inwards. Like, okay, well, how do we help you to make more money? Is it return to school? How are you safe in doing this? How can the program support you in your efforts to do this? What kind of resources can we bring? Because unfortunately, most nonprofit organizations, you may not have financial resources, but you might have someone who wants to provide an internship opportunity for someone that you work with. So there's a lot of different ways that it can look depending on the individual that you're working with, circumstance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and anybody else have any other observations here about some steps that advocates can take to address the economic impacts of crimes on survivors?
Well, I would say just being really open to the idea of the different ways that trauma can kind of affect people. I'm working with somebody right now, and she was partially stalked through the mail. So she actually, we just discovered for about a month, has not been opening her mail because it's a huge trigger for her. And so the economic impact of that for her is all of these bills that haven't been paid, things like that. And so, I had never thought of even to ask that question. Hey, how are you doing on, on that piece of it, on your on your bills and your finances? And so now, we have an appointment, and I'm going to sit down with her and open all of her mail with her, to address that sort of emotional, traumatic triggering. But it was just, it's a very sort of odd place where that economic impact came in that now I will be sure to address with every single one of my survivors.
Interesting. And, too, that could have also meant that notices from the justice system, any kind of important legal documents could have gone unresponded to, and then you can trigger, kind of a cascade of things going wrong at that end on her part as well, or on her behalf if things aren't discovered. Wow, that's a really important point.
And I will expect that I'll need to be doing some follow-up with some of the folks she didn't pay bills to. I can get in there with her permission and kind of intervene and ask for amnesty, if you will, on late bills and stuff.
Have you all ever had, and just to wrap up this question, but just let me throw out a quick question, how have you seen advocates, and how have you as advocates worked with people in the justice system to help lessen the impact of some of these crimes on victims? I mean, do you usually work directly with law enforcement or prosecutors? Is it usually always through the systems-based advocates? What kind of work have you done to kind of get in there on economic issues with people in the justice system directly? Is there anything you can think about or share with us?
Well, this is Kaylin, and some things that we've done is we work with them on different advocacy, community boards, steering committees, things of that nature. So, for example, I sit on the Detroit Police Department Chief of Police Advisory Board, and our organization is also an active member of the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office Family Violence Committee. So what we do is we bring our conversation to the table in places where it's often not addressed. So where, the focus of the conversation might be on other crimes that are committed, we consistently bring the conversation of domestic violence. And then even on another level, even when you have like the family violence meetings, they're already talking about domestic violence, but they're not going to specifically talk about economic abuse and how it affects the communities and the survivors that we serve. So working with different organizations around and different people and just bringing those conversations to the table and making it a priority is important, and that's something that the advocates can do on a regular basis. To interface with the justice system. In addition to that, we are also having conversations about what kind of training can we provide to the first responders in regards to domestic violence in our community.
And
Yeah,
so that's where that's where you could also bring in some of these economic issues. Great. Go ahead, Susan.
I was just going to say one of the things that I do is I took the WOW law enforcement guide, and I turned it basically into a 10-minute briefing on this issue that I can do with all law enforcement at roll call or at trainings, that focuses on how an awareness for them and why addressing this economic security helps them. And so the training piece. And then I think the other thing is that as an advocate, when you're working closely with specific detectives or specific responders, and you get a comfort level where you can talk about cases and they can tell you if they're hearing anything about concerns about economic issues, and then you can specifically provide information to obviously within bounds of confidentiality, but with that detective say about that particular person's economic concerns.
So what would that look like? Just some like examples from some of the work you've done, maybe in sexual assault cases. What would you say to a detective to clue them into what's going on with the survivor and her economic needs?
So the first one might be, and I referenced this before, but simply letting them know that this particular survivor might have an economic barrier to multiple trips into their jurisdiction for interviews or follow-up or anything like that. So I will have detectives who will come to to the survivor's home to do it there, so that their kids can still be there, so that she doesn't have to travel. That's one instance. And the other things would be these outside things like a drug and alcohol treatment situation. If I've got a survivor who is maybe in a tenuous emotional state, I might say to my detective, we need a little break here. We need to get some counseling. We need to get some treatment. And she's going to be in a much stronger place to answer these questions, to really participate fully. So we might put an investigation on hold when possible for a couple weeks or even a month, so that we can address finding funding for the counseling and getting that piece taken care of.
And before I go on to Allison, Kaylin, can I jump back to you a little bit and ask you about some of the work that you've done in Wayne County and Detroit around this issue with some of your it sounds like both traditional partners. You mentioned the Chief of Police Advisory Board, but some of the non-traditional partners like EEOC and the Department of Labor. I mean, what have you done with those agencies? And those aren't kind of the usual suspects, although of any of these groups, advocates really have the, I think, best tentacles into the community. But how have you worked with them on these issues?
Well, I think tentacles is a good word for it. I think that it's important sometimes for us to think outside of our area. And in that, really okay, what do people need to move forward? And really looking at a comprehensive approach, looking at even culturally competent strategies. We're in Detroit, so really, we look at what are the needs of African American survivors of domestic violence in our work. And so with that, there may be civil rights issues. So we work with the Department of Civil Rights, we work with the EEOC, the Department of Labor. And so in working with, we've even worked with, we have a large Latino population as well, and we've done some technical assistance and some work with some programs that help that community. And in widening our net and making these connections, because we found that sometimes survivors, we can help them get work. And so they're working, and then you're in a situation where perhaps you haven't worked for a very long time, and you might not quite understand how your paycheck calculates or some issue in your handbook, and now you feel that you were violated at home, and now you're being violated at work. And if it's not the case, for us to be able to explain what work rules are and have workshops around that and conversations before, you start work and even after, to still be a resource. Unfortunately, there has been a couple of cases and people that we've worked with that when they started work, they were sexually harassed or were otherwise violated. And so because we already had the connections and the resources in these different departments, was very easy for us to connect them with people and get the help that they needed right away to address that. And that's empowering just to know that these resources are there and that people hear you and that you're listened to and that you can be helped. It means a lot.
And then, so you're talking about both on a case-by-case basis, but also a systematized training. And I know, Allison,
Correct.
You are an extraordinary trainer and have done a lot of work in this area in Georgia for quite some time. So can you talk a little bit, building on what Kaylin was saying about some of the outreach that you've done and the importance of the training?
Yeah, so we work a lot with another state partner to provide trainings for law enforcement and for task forces, local coordinated community response teams, to help systems outside of, the advocacy community, but also law enforcement and prosecutors and judges really, really understand the role that economic security plays in whether a victim is safe or not and whether they get a successful prosecution or not. And we break this down in very real terms. So we start by talking about economic abuse and the role that plays in, as just one of the tactics. But then we talk about like the long-term effects of that, and we just really, really spell it out for folks about, why she may not be leaving this person after, law enforcement has gone out on multiple calls, or why she's not cooperating with prosecution. We explain things around, the time off of work that must be spent and sort of the life upheaval that has a consequence on her finances. And we talk about the dependence that a lot of victims have on that income, and how that impacts their decisions to report. And so I think we really are trying to tie these things together so that it's very real for everyone involved. Because, criminal justice system folks are as a virtue of their work, sort of very process oriented, and are often working with victims of crimes that aren't related to the perpetrator. These types of crimes are very different, obviously, because these victims have, unlike the victim of an armed robbery or what have you, they have emotional and physical and economic ties to the person who perpetrated the crime against them. So helping them to understand how that impacts how the victim will cooperate in the criminal justice process has really been helpful. And we also, I work with a state domestic violence coalition. We do a fatality review project in cooperation with our state's Commission on Family Violence, and we've this is where we highlight domestic violence homicides and sort of look at the steps that they took toward independence and see the moves that they made seeking safety and determine where there are access issues, where it's issues of access to the justice system or what have you, and we look for ways to improve. And we've focused for several years on this economic justice piece, this piece around how important it is, how financial stability is so tied to safety. And so this is a document that we publish an annual report every year, and I think folks, this is something that prosecutors and law enforcement and judges across the state read, and so that's the way that we're trying to make these connections with the criminal justice system.
And you have just done a lovely segue into our last question, which is some of the policy and structural changes that need to take place. Clearly talking about doing something that is widely distributed, that has a lot of ideas in it, that has direct information about this issue to key sectors in the justice system and beyond. That's something that you've done in Georgia. And maybe talk a little bit, can you build on that a little bit and maybe mention a couple of other sort of policy and structural changes that you've seen either take place or that you think really need to take place, maybe in your state and elsewhere to begin to cement this into people's thinking? I mean, we always talk about economic security equals safety should be a mantra that everybody should use all the time whenever they're working on sexual assault or domestic violence or stalking cases. So how else have you seen that happen? Or how would you like to see it happen?
Well, I think that it's a struggle in terms of, a policy, when you're pushing policy, that whether it's laws or the way a system or a statewide agency manages a program that victims access, like TANF or like child support or enforcement or what have you. I think that we historically as a movement have gotten really, really good at promoting criminal justice resolutions like responses, so improving recognition of domestic violence as a crime or sexual assault as a crime. And so we've really been able to paint a picture of the battered woman who needs rescuing, and we just need the criminal justice system to work in order to get her out of there. And as soon as we make it a real crime, we just put him in jail, and then we'll be done with it. And I think we've gotten good at that sort of developing that narrative. Where I would like to see us go in terms of the policy that we push is talking about not just domestic violence laws, criminal law or civil, how the civil courts work for victims, but also talking about broader issues of that impact economic well-being, economic justice. So an example of this would be something we've pushed in our state, not successfully yet, but flexible sick leave for any employer that provides sick leave. A law that we have pushed is for those employers to be required to let employees use that leave flexibly to care for sick children, not just themselves, or sick parents. And that comes from what we all know happens with a lot of victims is that they become, if they are leaving an abusive situation, they often become single parents overnight. And so wouldn't it be great if they had the flexibility to be able to use their sick leave to take care of their kids because they no longer have this other partner, this abusive partner that could, come home and stay home with a sick kid. And we've made this link or tried to make this link between, flexible sick leave and domestic violence and reducing homicides and reducing domestic violence because it is key because when a victim is not able to get approved leave to take care of her sick child, she has to take care of her sick child. So a lot of victims, wind up having to leave their employment for it. And we know that when victims can't make ends meet, they're more likely to go back to an abusive partner. So, it's a change in our narrative. It's not as easy as the tough on crime narrative that we've gotten really good at, but we've really got to expand it so that policymakers really understand the link and really start seeing issues like paid time off, sick time, livable wage issues. All of these things are very, very much linked to safety. And because we've had this dominant narrative for so long around criminal justice, it's a hard sell. People are often like, this is not a domestic violence issue, and I'm like, but it is, and let me explain why.
And explain why it impacts you in the criminal justice system, and that's why she's maybe not showing up for the things you want her to show up for.
Yeah.
So, Susan, anything you'd like to add to that in terms of policy and structural changes?
This is going to sound really, really specific, and this is sort of on the funding issue thing, but I think legitimizing client assistance funds as a really good, I think I found it's one of actually my best tools, is the ability to address some of these immediate and sometimes small things simply by paying for them. And so it's this idea of addressing long-term economic security by being able to provide some short-term relief. It could be something like money to renew somebody's driver's license, or money for counseling for the first 4 or 5 sessions of counseling before crime victims' compensation is awarded, or 1 month of rent that we can help somebody with, so that maybe they have a little bit of the ability to take a little time off from work, to address what else is going on for them. Because I'm so often grant funded on issues, and time again I'm told, this client assistance doesn't fall under this government granting kind of thing, and yet I have found the ability to really address some of these economic security issues can be a couple $100 at the right time to help out somebody's situation.
And that can make all the difference in the world. And we've also heard about how something as basic as being able to help someone pay for parking at the courthouse so that they can make it can make a huge difference. To wrap us up on this section, Kaylin, is there anything you'd like to add here in terms of policy and structural changes?
Well, actually, I wanted to talk about, I guess in regards to structure changes, when we do partner with other people to get the word out in the community, look at it more as a partnership versus just what can my agency and the people that I serve get out of it. So how can I help the EEOC? You would be surprised that you might then be called as an expert in that and asked to speak or to give them information so that when people directly interact with them that may also be experiencing some of these challenges, that they're able to be more effective in the work that they do.
That's right. That's great. That's kind of that symbiotic relationship that you can start to develop and kind of continue on and help them do their jobs better, which, they're seeing survivors. So that's great. That's great. Well, I'd like to thank you all. This is a wonderful discussion. Very, very, I think, enlightening. And unfortunately, we only have an hour to do this, and it touches the tip of the iceberg. So Mallory is going to talk about what WOW can provide in terms of understanding not just the advocate's point of view, but which is the part of our call, but all the other guides that WOW has done. And I'll tell you, it's an honor to work with this organization. And I think if any of you have not gone on their website, you should to see all the terrific resources. So Mallory, let me turn it back to you, and we'll wrap it up.
Great. Thank you so very much, Robin, and thank you to everyone on our panel. That was wonderful, and it's so great to hear you being such amazing spokespeople and advocates within your community for these issues and doing such great innovations. So to respond to the economic security needs of the survivors and the role of the advocates that we just discussed, WOW has developed the Victim Advocates Guide to Safety and Economic Security for Victims of Violence Against Women, also shortly known as the Victim Advocates Guide. So the Victim Advocates Guide is meant to be a very hands-on, user-friendly, and accessible document that can address why advocates should incorporate economic considerations into their work and lays out exactly how to do so. It includes user-friendly tools, policy recommendations, and training guidelines as well. The primary audience is justice system and community-based advocates, but is also relevant to STOP administrators and other justice system professionals. As we've been discussing, there's so much overlap within all of these and so much education that can be going on within these different groups. So the Victim Advocates Guide was developed in consultation with leading experts from around the country, including practicing advocates within local communities, law enforcement agencies, and universities, and with regard to model policies and existing best practices nationally. So the first chapter makes the case for why advocates should consider addressing economic security and defines what economic security is, which we've talked about pretty extensively today. The bulk of the guide is dedicated to the second chapter, which explores in detail many of the ways in which advocates can incorporate economic security into their core services, with any survivor. So this really is about making this part of your work within any interaction you have, whether the survivor chooses to report to the justice system or not, whether they're pretty far into the justice system or not, whether they're, they have a protection order in place but don't want to go any farther. So there's very small, very specific ways that advocates can still address economic security as it relates to the broader picture in terms of their housing, employment, transportation, education, or within their participation within the justice system specifically. So this section contains extensive checklists that give options for various scenarios ranging from intake and safety planning to understanding the economic costs and benefits to survivors of participating in the system. It also gives a great deal of information about what economic relief is, such as restitution or protection orders, and how victim advocates can help survivors access those resources. Additional chapters examine how advocates can support and in turn benefit from the work of other justice system sectors, as well as offering policies and protocols that may help to incorporate economic security into the work in ways that we've been talking about as well. Lastly, there's a number of supplemental materials that can be used by a variety of audiences. So here are a couple examples of the tools that we offer, including the Victim Advocate Pocket Guide, which is a short brochure that contains a number of simple checklists on, again, the cost benefits, the safety planning, interview questions, and potential evidence that survivors should be aware of in terms of whether law enforcement will need that for the case and whether that will help them with any consumer rights or civil remedies as well. So in addition to the tools we've discussed for advocates today, we also have guides and materials for a number of other sectors that can be found here online. We have one that's primarily written for sub-administrators and kind of covers the system as a whole, as well as guides and either pocket guides, brochures, or bench cards for law enforcement, prosecutors, and courts. All of these resources are free for you to download at will, use at will, as much and as often as you would like. Again, we don't want any of these recommendations to be overwhelming or overburdening your work in the system, as we know there's already so much that's on your plate and that you're dealing with. So really these are all offering a menu of options for you to choose from to make your work with survivors stronger and better and your collaboration stronger and better. So unfortunately that's just about all the time we have, but I just wanted to very quickly ask if anyone has any last-minute questions or comments for me or the panelists today. You can either ask in the chat function or dial *1 to unmute your phone if you're calling it over the phone.
And Mallory, while they're doing that, I wanted to also just tell them, like the last slide you had up on the prosecutor's guide, law enforcement, et cetera, those are great tools to use as you do co-training with any of those sectors. As you co-train with law enforcement or work with people in the academy and do the training, please share with them the guide and look at the tools that we have offered, because they can really help you help them do better training.
Great. That's a great point. Thank you, Robin.
Yeah. You're welcome.
All right, so last call for questions. Well, if anybody has any questions or comments going forward, please do not hesitate to contact me. My information is up here. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. Once again, I will be sending out the materials shortly. And a huge, huge thank you to Robin, Susan, Kaylin, and Allison for your time and the very valuable information you shared with us today.
Thank you, Mallory.
Have a wonderful afternoon.
Okay.